The millionaire's wheelchair-bound son had his childhood stolen when a homeless boy did that. The rain fell heavily over London that Thursday afternoon, turning the streets into raging rivers that swallowed everything in their path. The grey sky seemed to weigh down the entire city, as if carrying all the secrets and silences that inhabited the hearts of its millions of residents. In the chaotic traffic of Regent Street, Roger Alastair held the steering wheel of his imported sedan tightly, his tired eyes fixed on the red headlights multiplying before him. Another endless meeting had concluded, another day where numbers and reports consumed every minute of his existence. At 43, Roger had built a solid financial empire, respected in the most influential circles of the capital. His name opened doors, his signature moved millions, his opinion was awaited with reverence in the country's most important boardrooms. But on that rainy afternoon, as the windscreen wiper fought uselessly against the storm, he felt a different weight in his chest. It wasn't the pressure of business, nor the responsibility of commanding a company with hundreds of employees. It was something deeper, a sensation that had been slowly settling in his soul and which he refused to name. His phone rang for the 10th time in less than an hour. Roger glanced at the illuminated screen on the passenger seat. It was Stephen, his younger brother and vice president of the company. He ignored the call as he had done with the previous ones. He knew exactly what Stephen wanted to discuss. The same numbers, the same strategies, the same obsession with growth that had consumed them both for years. But at that moment, Roger couldn't think of anything beyond getting home, going up to his study and closing the door, isolating himself from the world as he always did. The Alastair family mansion was located in one of London's most affluent districts, an imposing 3-story building surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens and high walls that promised privacy and security. It was the kind of residence that appeared in decor magazines, with every detail planned by renowned architects and every room reflecting the good taste and prosperity of its inhabitants. But for Roger, that house was just a place where he slept a few hours a night, an address listed on his documents, a space he shared with people he knew less and less. The electronic gate opened automatically as the car approached. Roger parked in the spacious garage next to Valerie's white SUV and the adapted car that rarely left there. He turned off the engine and remained seated for a few moments, listening only to the insistent drumming of the rain on the vehicle's roof. He needed a few more seconds before entering, before putting on the mask again of the present husband and dedicated father he had never truly managed to be. Valerie awaited him in the living room, elegant as always in a beige-tailored suit that accentuated her slender figure. At 40, she maintained the same beauty that had captivated Roger 2 decades ago when they met at a charity gala. But that beauty now seemed cold, calculated, part of the perfect image she insisted on maintaining for the outside world. Her blonde hair was impeccably styled, her makeup light but precise, her jewelry discreet but expensive. She was the ideal wife for a successful businessman, the perfect hostess for important dinners, the woman who knew exactly what to say and how to behave in every situation. "Good evening," Roger said, loosening his tie as he crossed the room towards the stairs. "I need to speak with you," Valerie replied, her voice firm, but controlled. "It's about Peter." Roger stopped on the first step, his back tense. It was always about Peter. For the past 10 years, everything in that house revolved around the boy, his needs, his limitations, the silent guilt that hung over all of them like an invisible but constant fog. "What happened?" he asked, turning slowly to face his wife. "Nothing happened. That's precisely the problem." Valerie crossed her arms, her expression impenetrable. "The physiotherapist said he's unmotivated, that he doesn't try during sessions. He's becoming more and more isolated, more apathetic. We need to do something, Roger." He sighed, running a hand over his tired face. "Do what, Valerie? We've consulted the best doctors in the country. We've done every possible treatment. He has everything he needs here at home." "Everything but what truly matters," she murmured, but not loud enough for him to hear clearly. "What did you say?" "Nothing. Forget it." Valerie turned, her heels clicking on the marble floor as she headed to the kitchen. "Dinner's ready. Peter already ate in his room." Roger climbed the stairs with heavy steps, each one seeming to demand monumental effort. In the second-floor corridor, he stopped before Peter's bedroom door. Light was on beneath the crack. He raised a hand to knock, hesitated, then let his arm fall again. What kind of father was he, needing to gather courage to talk to his own son? He moved away silently and headed to his study at the end of the corridor. There, among the economics books, financial reports, and the always-on computer screen, he knew exactly who he was and what to do. There was no guilt, no accusing glances, no overwhelming weight of a past he preferred not to examine too closely. In the next room, Peter was awake in his specially adapted bed, his eyes fixed on the white ceiling as he listened to the rain through the slightly open window. At 14, the boy had already learned to live with the silence that dominated that house, with the absence disguised as presence, with the love that existed in theory, but which he rarely managed to truly feel. His wheelchair leaned against the wall, next to the wardrobe full of expensive clothes he only wore for medical appointments, or when Valerie insisted on taking him to some carefully selected social event. Peter was too thin for his age, his face pale from spending entire days indoors, his brown eyes carrying an ancient sadness that no sophisticated toy could erase. Since the accident that changed his life forever at 4 years old, he had learned to make himself small, not to bother, to accept that his condition was a burden to everyone around him, especially his mother. Valerie had never said it aloud, but Peter perceived it in the way she avoided looking him in the eyes for too long, in the haste with which she left his room after checking if he was all right in the way. She sighed whenever she had to reorganize her schedule because of one of his medical appointments. The boy rolled over in bed, picking up the tablet from the bedside table. On the illuminated screen, photos of other children playing in parks, running on the beach, playing ball in the street. He spent hours observing those images, trying to imagine what it would be like to have real friends, to be able to leave the house without every step being a planned event with military precision, to feel part of the world instead of just a spectator behind bulletproof glass and high walls. A lightning flash lit up the room, followed seconds later by a thunderous clap that made the windows rattle. Peter instinctively cowered under the covers. He wasn't afraid of storms, but this particular one seemed different, more intense, as if nature was trying to communicate something urgent that he couldn't decipher. Downstairs, Mrs. Clara, the housekeeper who had worked for the family for over 15 years, finished tidying the kitchen after dinner. At 58, she was the only person in that house who seemed to truly see Peter as a child and not as a problem to be managed. It was she who brought him homemade biscuits secretly to his room, who invented funny stories to make him smile, who sat beside him for a few minutes just to talk about nothing in particular. Valerie didn't approve of these liberties, but tolerated them because Mrs. Clara was efficient and discreet, rare qualities in times of social media and domestic staff gossip. The storm continued outside, growing more violent. Mrs. Clara looked out the kitchen window, worried about her husband who worked as a night security guard on the other side of the city. He would have difficulty getting home in that deluge. She quickly made the sign of the cross, whispering a silent prayer before turning off the lights and retiring to her room at the back of the house. In his study, Roger tried to concentrate on a financial report, but the words danced before his eyes without making sense. Something was wrong that night, a restlessness he couldn't name. He got up from his chair, approached the window, and watched the storm outside. Lightning bolts cut through the dark sky in increasingly frequent sequences. The rain fell in dense curtains that barely allowed sight of the property's illuminated gardens. His phone vibrated on the desk. Another message from Stephen. "We urgently need to discuss the merger proposal. Call as soon as you can." Roger typed a quick reply. "Talk tomorrow," and tossed the device back onto the table. He had no head for business at that moment, no matter how important the decision he needed to make. He sat down again, but this time he didn't open any files. He just sat there, hands clasped on the table, eyes lost in the void before him. When had everything become so complicated? When had he stopped knowing? His own family? At what exact moment had his life transformed into that endless succession of obligations, responsibilities, and estrangements? He thought of Peter, the boy he saw so little despite living in the same house. He vaguely remembered what his son was like before the accident, a laughing, restless child who ran through the gardens chasing butterflies, who woke up on Sundays jumping on his bed, who asked endless questions about everything. After the tragedy, that child had disappeared, replaced by a silent boy who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his narrow shoulders. And he, Roger, had allowed it to happen. He had taken refuge in work, in the convenient excuse that he needed to secure the family's future, that someone needed to keep the structure running. But the truth, which he rarely admitted even to himself, was that he didn't know how to deal with the guilt, with the weight of not having been present on that fatal night, with the certainty that if he had made different decisions, everything could have been avoided. A noise downstairs pulled him from his thoughts. He heard Valerie talking on the phone, her voice shrill even at a distance, probably talking to a friend about some social event. She filled her days with endless engagements, charity lunches, board meetings, dinners at sophisticated restaurants. Anything that kept her away from that house and the inconvenient truths that inhabited its silent corridors. Their marriage was another subject Roger preferred not to think about much. There were no arguments, no infidelities, no open conflicts. Just a polite coexistence between two people who once loved each other but who were now practically strangers sharing the same address. They had slept in separate rooms for years, claiming Roger's incompatible hours disturbed Valerie's sleep. It was a convenient lie that neither of them questioned. Another lightning flash, another clap of thunder. The storm seemed endless. Roger looked at the clock on the wall, past 10 at night. He should have been tired after the long day, but he felt restless, unable to relax. He decided to take a shower and try to sleep, even knowing he would probably be awake for hours, his mind circling the same unsolved problems. As he walked down the corridor towards his room, he heard a noise coming from Peter's room. He stopped, listening intently. Silence. Perhaps he had imagined it. He continued walking, but then the sound repeated, louder this time. It was a muffled groan, as if someone was trying not to make noise but couldn't completely contain it. Roger approached the door and knocked lightly. "Peter, are you all right?" A pause. Then the boy's voice trying to sound normal. "Yes, Dad. I'm fine." But he wasn't. Roger knew that tone, the desperate attempt not to be a bother, not to add another problem to the family's already long list of worries. He opened the door slowly and found Peter sitting on the bed, his face wet with tears that he was trying to quickly wipe away with the back of his hand. "What happened?" Roger asked, entering the room and closing the door behind him. "Were you in pain?" "No," Peter lied, looking away. "It was just a nightmare. It's over now." Roger approached and sat on the edge of the bed, a gesture so rare that Peter stared at him in surprise. They sat there for a few moments, the heavy silence between them laden with unsaid things, with conversations that should have happened years ago, but had been postponed until they became impossible. "You can tell me," Roger finally said, his voice softer than usual. "I know I haven't been the best father in the world, but I still care about you. I always have, even when I seem distant." Peter bit his lip, debating internally. Part of him wanted to keep everything hidden as he always had, but another part, tired of carrying that weight alone, yearned to share even a little of what he felt. It was this second part that won. "I just feel so alone sometimes, Dad. So useless. Like I'm good for nothing, like I'm just a burden to everyone." The words hit Roger like punches, each one carrying the painful truth of his failure as a father. He extended a hesitant hand and touched his son's shoulder, an awkward gesture from someone unaccustomed to showing affection. "You are not a burden, Peter, never were. If anyone failed here, it was me and your mother. We thought that giving you the best treatment, the best house, the best things would be enough, but we forgot the most important thing." "What?" Peter asked, his eyes wide. "To be present, to talk, to listen, to be a real family, and not just people who share the same surname and address." Tears again ran down Peter's face, but this time he didn't try to hide them. Roger pulled him into an awkward but sincere hug, and for the first time in years, father and son remained like that, connected by something more real than obligations and guilt. "We're going to try to change this," Roger whispered. "I don't know how yet, but we're going to try. I promise." It was then that the pain came, sudden and violent like a lightning bolt through his chest. Roger abruptly released Peter, clutching, his hand to his heart, his face contorting in agony. He couldn't breathe properly, the air seeming trapped in his lungs, sweat instantly beading on his forehead. "Dad! What's happening?" Peter's voice was choked with panic. "Dad, answer me!" But Roger couldn't reply. The pain was unbearable, radiating from his chest to his left arm, climbing up his neck, blurring his vision. He vaguely knew he needed help, that he needed to get to the hospital as quickly as possible, but his body wouldn't obey his brain's commands. He staggered, leaning against the wall, and began to drag himself towards the door. "I'll call Mum," Peter shouted, grabbing the phone from the bedside table with trembling hands. But Roger made a negative gesture. There was no time. He needed to get out of there, get to the car, drive to the hospital. It was the only clear thing in his mind, consumed by pain and fear. He managed to reach the corridor, then the stairs. Valerie appeared downstairs, her eyes wide as she saw him descending, leaning on the railing, his face pale and covered in sweat. "What happened, Roger? What's going on?" He didn't answer. He couldn't waste time explaining. He staggered across the living room, ignoring Valerie's shouts, and went out through the door leading to the garage. The rain hit him immediately, drenching him in seconds, but he barely noticed. He opened the car door with difficulty, his hands shaking, and threw himself into the driver's seat. The engine started on the first try. Roger pressed the accelerator before the gate had even finished opening, scraping the side mirror against the wall. Visibility was practically nil in that storm, the wipers useless against the volume of water falling from the sky. But he continued, guided by instinct and desperation, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as the pain in his chest grew and grew until it filled every inch of his being. He couldn't go far. 2 blocks later, the pain reached an unbearable peak, and his vision completely darkened. With the last vestige of consciousness left to him, Roger managed to swerve the car to the side of the road and step on the brake before everything went black. In the mansion, Valerie was screaming into the phone with emergency services, while Mrs. Clara tried to calm Peter, who was crying desperately in his room. The housekeeper ran to the garage and found the gate open. Roger's car vanished into the storm. Her heart tightened. She had known that man for 15 years, had seen him build his empire, had seen him gradually distance himself from his family, had seen the loneliness grow in his eyes even surrounded by success and wealth. And now, on that stormy night, something told her that nothing would ever be the same again. The rain continued to fall mercilessly over London, washing the streets, filling the drains, dragging everything in its path, and somewhere among those dark, flooded streets, Roger Alastair lay unconscious in the seat of his car, his heart struggling to keep beating, his life hanging by an increasingly thin thread. It was then that red and blue lights began to appear through the curtain of rain. Someone had seen the car parked strangely and called the police. Someone who was now approaching, running through the storm, a small dark figure that seemed to emerge from the very shadows of the night. Someone who was about to change the fate of that family forever, even without yet knowing the role they would play in this story, that was only just beginning to unfold. The car door was opened from outside. Small hands touched Roger's wrist, checking for vital signs. A young voice shouted for help, cutting through the stormy night. And as the sirens approached ever closer, that unknown presence remained there, firm and determined, as if instinctively knowing that this was the moment when everything would begin, the precise instant when the impossible would cross the threshold of the possible, and nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same again. The storm roared around, but inside that car, in the presence of that mysterious figure, who still had no name or face for the Alastair family, there was a strange calm, a silent certainty that something bigger was in motion, something that transcended rational explanations and that only time would reveal in all its complexity and beauty. The night was just beginning, and with it, a journey that would test the limits of faith, love, redemption, and the possibility of starting over when all seems lost. The sound of sirens cut through the night like sharp blades, mingling with the dull rumble of thunder that still echoed over the city. Roger gradually regained consciousness. Fragments of perception slowly returning. The metallic taste in his mouth, the sharp pain in his chest that had now transformed into a constant discomfort, the smell of rain and wet asphalt entering through the open car doors. He blinked several times, trying to focus his vision, and that's when he saw the face hovering over his, intermittently illuminated by the emergency lights. It was a child. A boy of perhaps 9 or 10, too thin, drenched from head to toe, with large, dark eyes that shone with a strange intensity. His black hair was plastered to his forehead, his worn t-shirt clinging to his frail body, his bare feet covered in mud. But what most impressed Roger, even in his confused state, was the expression on the boy's face, a mixture of genuine concern and something more, something he couldn't identify but which seemed familiar, like a distant memory of something he had once known but forgotten over the years. "You'll be all right," the boy said, his voice surprisingly calm for someone so young. "Help is already coming." Roger tried to speak, but only a hoarse groan escaped his throat. The boy placed one of his hands on Roger's chest, right where the pain throbbed, and Roger felt something strange, a warmth radiating from that touch, not uncomfortable, but comforting, as if the boy's body emitted some kind of energy he couldn't explain. He closed his eyes again, exhausted, and let himself be carried away by that sensation as the paramedics' voices approached. Everything happened very quickly after that. Professional hands transferred him to a stretcher, placed an oxygen mask on his face, connected beeping machines urgently. Roger only had time to see the boy step away, standing on the pavement in the rain as the ambulance left with its sirens blaring. He wanted to ask who that boy was, what he was doing there at that time of night, but he was already being taken inside the vehicle, and the door closed, blocking his view. At the hospital, the following hours were a blur of fluorescent lights, hurried voices, needle pricks, and endless tests. The doctors spoke of a heart attack, blocked arteries, emergency procedures. Valerie arrived pale and nervous, her eyes red from crying during the journey, but maintaining her typical composure even in extreme situations. She stayed by Roger's side, holding his hand, but there was more duty than affection in that gesture, as if she were playing the role expected of her at that moment. "It was a mild heart attack," the cardiologist explained the next morning, when Roger was already stabilized in the ICU. "You were lucky. If you had taken a few more minutes to receive care, the consequences could have been much more severe. We will need to perform some procedures, adjust medications, and you will have to make significant lifestyle changes." Roger only half listened, his mind still returning to that image of the boy in the rain, those small hands on his chest, that inexplicable warmth. Who had called for help? How had a child appeared at the exact moment he needed it? And where was he now? "Valerie," he called out in a weak voice. "That boy who was with me when the ambulance arrived, do you know who he was?" She frowned, confused. "What boy?" "The paramedics didn't mention anyone. They just said someone had called to report a strangely parked car. But there was a boy there. He stayed with me until help arrived." Roger felt a strange urgency to find that child, as if it were important in a way he couldn't articulate. A street boy, it seemed to me. Very thin, no shoes. Valerie sighed, clearly thinking this was a result of the medication or trauma. "You were in shock, Roger. You probably imagined things. The important thing now is for you to recover." But Roger knew he hadn't imagined anything. That boy was real as the pain he still felt in his chest, as real as the feeling that something fundamental had changed that night. He decided that as soon as he was discharged, he would look for that boy. He needed to thank him. He needed to understand what had happened. The days in the hospital dragged on, slow and monotonous. Stephen appeared with a folder full of documents that needed urgent signatures, speaking quickly about decisions that couldn't wait, about important clients and tight deadlines. Roger dismissed him with unusual abruptness, something that surprised his brother, accustomed to always having his attention. Peter visited him only once, brought by Mrs. Clara in his wheelchair. The boy was pale, his eyes still filled with fear at the possibility of having lost his father. Roger hugged him tightly, feeling a wave of emotion that caught him off guard. There in that hospital room, with death having passed so close, he realized with painful clarity how much time he had wasted, how many precious moments he had let slip through his fingers in the name of a career that now seemed much less important than he had always imagined. "We're going to spend more time together when I get out of here," he promised Peter. "I don't know exactly how, but we'll find a way." Peter nodded, wanting to believe, but having learned over the years not to put too much hope in adult promises. Still, there was something different in his father's eyes, a new sincerity that made him feel a spark of hope growing in his heart, bruised by so many disappointments. While Roger remained hospitalized, Valerie took care of maintaining appearances, answering worried calls from friends and acquaintances, with the carefully constructed narrative of momentary stress that would soon be resolved. "Nothing serious," she said on the phone in a controlled voice. "Just a warning from his body to slow down. You know how it is. These businessmen don't know when to stop." But alone in her room, late at night, Valerie allowed the mask to fall. She sat before the mirror and stared at her own reflection, seeing a woman she no longer recognized. When had she become that cold person, that distant wife, that mother who fled from her own son? She tried to remember exactly when everything had started to crumble, but it was difficult to pinpoint a specific moment. Perhaps it had been a gradual process, brick by brick, excuse by excuse, until one day she woke up and no longer knew who she was. Peter's accident, she thought, had been the turning point. Before that, despite the normal problems of any marriage, they were still a family. They went out together, laughed together, made plans for the future. After that terrible night, everything changed. Guilt settled like a permanent guest in her soul, and she had done her best not to look directly at it. She compensated with efficiency, with organization, with the maintenance of a perfect routine. But love, genuine affection, that had been lost somewhere along the way. A week later, Roger was discharged with a list of medical recommendations and prescriptions that radically changed his routine. No excessive stress, moderate exercise under supervision, controlled diet, psychological counseling. It was a sentence he accepted with a mixture of resignation and something akin to relief. Perhaps this was the excuse he needed to make the changes he had been avoiding for years. On the way back home, sitting in the back seat of the car driven by Valerie, Roger asked her to drive past the spot where he had stopped that night. He wanted to see if he could find any sign of the boy, any clue that would help him locate him. Valerie rolled her eyes but complied with the request, guiding the car through the now dry streets under a strong sun that seemed to deny there had ever been a storm there. Roger got out of the car carefully, still weak, and examined the area. It was a commercial stretch, with closed shops and little movement. He approached a coconut water vendor on the corner and asked if he knew a thin boy about 10 years old who hung around there. The man thought for a moment before nodding. "Ah, you must be talking about Kyle. He lives on these streets, helping here and there, asking for something when there's no other way. Good boy, never seen him do anything wrong, but I haven't seen him in the last few days." Kyle. Finally a name. Roger felt a strange satisfaction at being able to put a name to that face that wouldn't leave his mind. "Do you know where I can find him?" he asked. The vendor shrugged. "He doesn't have a fixed place. Sometimes he's in the small square, sometimes he sleeps under the flyover when it rains. It's hard to say. But if you're patient and keep an eye out, you'll eventually run into him around here." Roger thanked him and returned to the car, determined to come back as many times as necessary until he found the boy. Valerie didn't ask questions, but her silence was eloquent. She thought it was a senseless obsession, a result of the trauma he had suffered. But Roger didn't care what she thought. Something inside him insisted that finding Kyle was essential, that their encounter in the storm had not been mere chance. The following days established a new routine at the Allister mansion. Roger, prevented by doctors from immediately returning to work, spent his mornings at home for the first time in years. Stephen temporarily took over command of the company, something he did with an enthusiasm that didn't go unnoticed by Roger. There was an ambition there, a glint in his younger brother's eyes that made him vaguely uncomfortable, but he was too tired to worry about it at that moment. Instead, Roger began to dedicate time to Peter. They had breakfast together, talked about the boy's studies, watched movies in the afternoon. It was strange at first, that forced closeness after years of estrangement, but little by little they found a rhythm. Peter was visibly more animated, more talkative, as if a long-forgotten flower was finally receiving water and sun. Valerie observed these interactions from a distance, a mixture of conflicting feelings crossing her chest. Part of her was happy to see father and son growing closer. Another part felt threatened, as if this new dynamic revealed by contrast her own failures as a mother. And there was a third layer, deeper and more painful, the envy of seeing Peter opening up to Roger in a way he had never opened up to her. One afternoon, when Roger left for one of his doctor-supervised walks, Valerie entered Peter's room. The boy was doing homework, concentrated on a math problem. She stood at the door for a few moments, watching him, trying to find the right words to say something that had been stuck in her throat for years. "Peter," she finally called, "can we talk?" The boy looked up, surprised. Spontaneous conversations with his mother were rare, usually reserved for practical matters about schedules and appointments. "Of course, Mum." Valerie approached and sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped in her lap, her posture upright even in that moment of attempted vulnerability. "I know I haven't been the best mother to you," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I know I've been distant, even cold. And I want you to know that has nothing to do with you. You were never the problem." Peter stared at her in silence, not knowing what to say. Part of him wanted to believe those words, but years of subtle rejection had built thick walls around his heart. "After your accident," Valerie continued, "I just didn't know how to cope. The guilt was so great, so heavy, that I found it easier to distance myself than to face it. I know that was cowardly of me. I know you suffered because of it." "Was it your fault?" Peter asked, his voice small but loaded with a question he had held for a decade. "The accident?" Valerie closed her eyes, tears finally escaping through her tightly shut eyelids. It was the first time in years she had truly cried, without restraint, without concern for image. "I was driving that night. I was nervous, distracted because of an argument I had with your father. I didn't see the curve in time. It was all so fast." Peter felt something stirring inside his chest, a mixture of anger, sadness, and, surprisingly, compassion. He saw his mother not as the distant, perfect figure she had always seemed, but as a broken person, struggling with her own demons, trying to survive the best way she could. "I don't blame you, Mum," he finally said, and realized with surprise that it was true. It was an accident. Accidents happen. Valerie sobbed, extending a hesitant hand to touch Peter's. He didn't pull away. They stayed like that for long minutes, mother and son connected for the first time in years, not by words, but by the mutual recognition of the pain they both carried. When Roger returned from his walk, he found them like that, and something in his chest warmed. Perhaps it wasn't too late. Perhaps there was still a chance to rebuild that family, to turn that house into a real home. But the peace was fragile and would soon be tested. A few days later, during dinner, Roger announced that he had hired a private detective to locate Kyle. He wanted to find the boy, thank him personally, perhaps help him in some concrete way. Valerie dropped her cutlery with more force than necessary. "Don't you think you're exaggerating, Roger? He was just a child who was in the wrong place at the right time, or the right place at the wrong time. You don't need to turn this into a mission." "He saved my life, Valerie. The paramedic saved your life. That boy probably just called for help. Anyone would have done the same." But Roger knew there was more to it than that. He couldn't explain it rationally, but he felt deep in his soul that Kyle was important, that his role that night had been more significant than Valerie was willing to admit. "I'll find him anyway," he said firmly, "with or without your approval." Peter watched the discussion in silence, intrigued by the mysterious boy who had made such an impact on his father. Part of him wanted to meet Kyle, to understand what was so special about him. Another part was afraid, an undefined fear that the arrival of this stranger might destroy the fragile reconnection the family was beginning to build. The detective took less than a week to locate Kyle. He lived on the central London streets with no known family. supporting himself with odd jobs and the occasional generosity of local shopkeepers. He was 10 years old, had never attended school regularly, and was known in the area as a quiet but helpful boy, always willing to assist those in need. Roger went to the location indicated by the detective one Tuesday afternoon. He found Kyle sitting on the steps of an abandoned church, sharing a piece of bread with a stray dog. The boy looked up as Roger approached, and there was a moment of mutual recognition. "You're better," Kyle said, a gentle smile lighting up his thin face. "Thanks to you," Roger replied, sitting beside him, without caring that his expensive suit was getting dirty. "You saved my life that night." Kyle shrugged, uncomfortable with the compliment. "I just did what anyone should do." "But you're not just anyone, are you?" Roger said, studying the boy's face. "There's something different about you. I felt it when you touched my chest that night. It wasn't just my imagination." The boy looked away, clearly uneasy with the direction of the conversation. "I pray for people. Sometimes good things happen. I can't explain it better than that." Roger stayed there for over an hour, talking with Kyle, listening to his stories, impressed by the maturity and serenity emanating from this child, who should have been traumatized by the circumstances of his life, but who, instead, radiated a peace he himself had never experienced. When he finally stood to leave, Roger made a proposal that would change everything. "Come home with me. It doesn't have to be forever if you don't want it to be, but at least let me give you a safe place to sleep, proper food, maybe a chance to go to school." Kyle stared at him for long seconds, those dark eyes seeming to see through all the layers of defense Roger had built throughout his life. "Why?" he asked simply. "Because you gave me a second chance," Roger replied, and realized it was the pure truth. "And because I don't think our meeting that night was a coincidence. I think you're in my life for a reason, and I want to find out what it is." Kyle looked at the dog beside him, then at the streets he knew so well, and finally back at Roger. There was fear in his eyes, but also hope, that fragile hope of someone who had long given up waiting for miracles, but who suddenly saw one materializing before him. "All right," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll go with you." And so, as the sun set over London, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, two lives intertwined in a way neither could foresee. Roger didn't yet know that by bringing Kyle home, he was bringing not just a needy boy, but a force that would challenge everything he thought he knew about reality, faith, and the limits of the possible. He didn't know that this decision would divide his family, test his marriage, and force him to confront truths about himself that he had been avoiding for decades. But at that moment, walking side by side with Kyle towards the car, Roger felt only a quiet certainty that he was doing the right thing. And for the first time in many years, that was enough. Kyle's arrival at the Allister mansion was like throwing a stone into a still lake, creating ripples that expanded in ever-widening circles, disturbing the carefully maintained surface of that family. Valerie was in the living room when Roger entered through the main door with the boy beside him, and the expression on her face quickly shifted from surprise to thinly veiled disapproval. "This is Kyle," Roger announced, his hand resting protectively on the boy's shoulder. "He's going to stay with us for a while." Kyle looked around with wide eyes, clearly intimidated by the ostentation of a house that seemed to have stepped out of a magazine. His bare feet left discreet marks on the impeccably polished marble floor, his worn clothes a stark contrast to the sophisticated decor surrounding him. But despite his visible discomfort, there was a dignity in his posture, a composure that impressed even Valerie, though she would never admit it aloud. "Roger, can I speak with you for a minute?" Valerie's voice was controlled, but there was steel beneath the polished surface. "In private, please." Roger gestured to Mrs. Clara, who was observing the scene from the kitchen entrance. "Clara, could you take Kyle to the guest room, prepare a bath for him, and see if you can find some suitable clothes among Peter's old things?" The housekeeper nodded with a warm smile, extending her hand to the boy. "Come with me, dear. You must be hungry too. I'll prepare a snack while you clean up." Kyle followed Mrs. Clara, casting an uncertain glance at Roger before disappearing up the corridor. As soon as they were alone, Valerie dropped all pretense of civility. Have you completely lost your mind? Bringing a street boy into our home without even consulting me? He saved my life, Valerie. Then send a Christmas hamper. Make a donation to a charity in his name. But bring him to live here. Have you thought about the consequences, the risks? What risks? He's a child, not a criminal. Valerie crossed her arms, frustration evident in every line of her body. You know nothing about him, where he came from, who his family is, what kind of influence he might bring into this house. And what will we tell people? How will we explain his presence? We don't need to explain anything to anyone, Roger replied, his voice firmer than Valerie was accustomed to hearing. This is our home, and I decided to help a child in need. If that bothers you or anyone else, that's your problem, not mine. It was the first time in years that Roger had taken such a direct stand against his wife, and both felt the weight of that moment. Valerie opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by Peter's arrival, who wheeled his chair into the living room with a curious expression. Dad, is it true? Is there a new boy here? Roger smiled, relieved by the interruption. Yes, there is. His name is Kyle. You'll meet him at dinner. I think you two will get along well. Peter couldn't contain his excitement. It had been so long since he had contact with another child, since he had anyone to talk to besides adults and private tutors. The prospect of having someone his age nearby, even temporarily, rekindled a hope he thought he had lost long ago. Meanwhile, in the guest room on the second floor, Kyle experienced for the first time in his life what it was like to take a truly hot bath with abundant water and soap that smelled of flowers. Mrs. Clara had left soft towels and clean clothes on the bed, and he touched them with reverence, almost afraid that it was all a dream from which he would wake up back on the cold streets and dangers of the night. After the bath, dressed in jeans and a t-shirt that were a little too big for him, Kyle explored the room with contained curiosity. The bed was enormous, covered with soft white sheets that felt like clouds. There was a window overlooking the gardens, a desk with neatly arranged books, an empty wardrobe waiting to be filled. It was more space than he had ever had in his entire life, and for a moment he felt lost in that immensity. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Mrs. Clara, carrying a tray with sandwiches, fruit and orange juice. I brought you a snack, dear. You must be starving. Kyle ate slowly, savoring each bite as if it were a treasure. Mrs. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, watching him with maternal tenderness. As he ate, she told him about the house routine, about Peter and his wheelchair, about Roger and Valerie trying to prepare him for what lay ahead. Mrs. Valerie might seem a little cold at first, Mrs. Clara gently warned, but don't take it to heart. She has her reasons for being the way she is, even if they're not good excuses. The important thing is that Mr. Roger wants you here, and Peter will surely love having your company. Kyle nodded, swallowing the last piece of sandwich. I don't want to cause problems, he said softly. If it's better, I can leave. Oh, don't even think about it. Mrs. Clara patted his hand affectionately. You're here because you deserve to be. Every child deserves a roof over their head and food on the table. And who knows, maybe you're here for a greater reason than any of us understand right now. Dinner that night was tense and uncomfortable. Valerie remained polite but distant, asking Kyle minimal questions and responding in monosyllables whenever possible. Peter, on the other hand, couldn't contain his curiosity, bombarding the new boy with questions about his life on the streets, his experiences, his stories. Kyle answered with simplicity, without dramatizing or seeking pity, merely recounting the facts of his existence with a naturalness that impressed everyone. Roger observed the interactions carefully, noting how Kyle had a way of speaking that conveyed calm, how his words were chosen with care, how there was a wisdom in his eyes that seemed far beyond his 10 years. There was something more to that. Boy, he was sure, something that went beyond what the eyes could see. After dinner, Roger suggested that Peter show Kyle his game collection. The two boys retired to Peter's room, leaving the adults in the living room. Valerie wasted no time. This isn't going to work, Roger. How long do you intend to keep up this charade? It's not a charade. He's a child who needs help, and we are in a position to offer it. We? Don't include me in this decision you made alone. She picked up her purse and car keys. I'm sleeping at the penthouse apartment tonight. I need to think clearly, and I can't do that here. Roger didn't try to stop her. He knew that forcing things would only worsen the situation. Valerie needed time to process, to accept, to perhaps eventually understand why this was so important to him. In Peter's room, the atmosphere was completely different. The two boys chatted animatedly, surrounded by video game consoles, books and toys that Peter had never truly enjoyed due to lack of company. Kyle didn't know most of those games, had never held a controller in his life, but he was willing to learn. Peter, radiant at finally having someone to share with, taught with patience and enthusiasm. "It's strange," Peter commented after a few hours when they were already lying in their respective beds, the lights off, but neither of them sleepy. "You just arrived, but it feels like I've known you for a long time." "I feel the same way," Kyle replied in the darkness. "Sometimes the right people show up at the right time. My grandmother used to say that before she passed away." "You had a grandmother?" Peter rolled over to face Kyle's shadow in the other bed. "I did. She raised me until I was 6. Then she got sick and had to leave. That's when I ended up on the streets. I'm sorry. That must have been very hard." "It was," Kyle admitted, "but she taught me important things before she left. She taught me about faith, about kindness, about believing there's always light even when everything seems dark, and those lessons have kept me alive until now." Peter was silent for a moment, absorbing those words. "Do you really believe that? That there's always light?" "I do. We can't always see it, but it's there, just like now in this dark room. Our eyes can't see, but we know the sun will rise tomorrow anyway." That simple conversation touched something deep in Peter, something that had been dormant for years under layers of frustration, loneliness, and resignation. For the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of genuine hope blooming in his chest. The following days established a new dynamic in the house. Kyle woke early, helped Mrs. Clara with small household chores, even when she insisted it wasn't necessary. He spent his mornings with Peter, sometimes playing, sometimes talking, sometimes just staying in. Shared silence that was somehow not uncomfortable. Roger observed them from a distance, noting how Peter was different, more animated, more present, as if a light that had gone out inside him was slowly being rekindled. But not everything was harmony. Valerie returned home after 3 days, but maintained a frosty distance from Kyle. She wasn't openly rude, but made it clear through 1,000 small gestures that he was not welcome in her space. She changed meal times, started dining in her room, invented engagements that kept her out of the house during the day. It was a silent, but effective rejection, and although Kyle didn't complain, Roger saw the discreet hurt in his eyes. The situation worsened when Stephen showed up for an unannounced visit. Roger's younger brother, 40 years old, single, entirely dedicated to the company, had always harbored thinly veiled ambition to take charge. When he learned of Kyle's presence through Valerie, who had called him in a moment of frustration, he decided to personally verify what was happening. "Roger, I need to speak with you," Stephen said, his voice serious after initial greetings, "about this child you brought home." "His name is Kyle," Roger corrected, already preparing for the confrontation he knew was coming. "All right, about Kyle then. Have you considered how this might affect the company's image? People are already commenting. There are rumors circulating about emotional instability, about impulsive decisions. The board is concerned." "The board or you, Stephen?" Roger looked directly at his brother. "Because it seems to me you're more interested in using this as an excuse to question my leadership than genuinely concerned about the company's well-being." Stephen had the decency to look minimally embarrassed, but quickly recovered. "This isn't about personal ambition. It's about responsibility. You suffered a heart attack, Roger. You're clearly going through some kind of existential crisis, and now you bring a street boy to live with you. How do you expect me, as vice president, not to question your ability to make rational decisions?" The discussion dragged on for over an hour, with arguments being thrown back and forth. In the end, Roger made his position clear. He would not back down from his decision about Kyle, and if the board wanted to question his leadership, they should do so formally. Stephen left dissatisfied, but Roger knew this was far from over. While the adults battled their wars of power and control, something extraordinary began to happen with Peter. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. a tingling in his legs during breakfast, a slight sensation of warmth where before there had only been numbness. He didn't mention it to anyone at first, afraid it was just imagination, a placebo effect of finally having found some happiness in his life. But as the days passed, the sensations became more defined. One morning, while Kyle was sitting at the foot of his bed telling a story about a wounded bird he had helped on the streets, Peter felt his toes move. Just a little, a minimal tremor, but definite and real. His eyes widened, his heart pounding. "Kyle," he whispered, his voice trembling. "My toes. I can move my toes." The other boy looked at him with that serene smile that had become familiar. "How wonderful, Peter. Your body is waking up." "You don't understand," Peter explained, tears beginning to stream down his face. "I haven't been able to move anything from my legs down for 10 years. The doctors said the injury was permanent. And now I moved my toes." Kyle moved closer and placed one of his hands on Peter's leg, exactly as he had done on Roger's chest that stormy night. The same sensation of warmth radiated from that touch, comforting and strange at the same time. "Sometimes the impossible just needs a small opening to become possible," he said simply. Peter wanted to call his parents immediately, shout the news to the whole world, but Kyle stopped him with a gesture. "Wait a little longer. Let it grow naturally. When the time is right, everyone will know." There was a wisdom in that advice that Peter couldn't deny, so he agreed to keep it a secret for now. But the hope that small movement had awakened in him was impossible to completely contain. He started to smile more, to have more energy, to be interested in things that hadn't mattered to him for years. Mrs. Clara was the first to notice the changes. She watched the two boys with growing curiosity, noting how Peter seemed different since Kyle's arrival. There was a new sparkle in his eyes, a vitality she hadn't seen in years. One afternoon, while changing Peter's bed linen, she heard voices coming from the garden where the boys were playing. She approached the window and saw something that took her breath away. Peter was in his chair as always, but Kyle was kneeling on the grass in front of him, his hands on the other boy's legs, his eyes closed as if in deep concentration. There was an intensity in that scene, something that transcended the ordinary, that made the air around them seem denser, more laden with meaning. Mrs. Clara was not a particularly religious woman, but she attended church on Sundays and believed in forces greater than human reason could explain. Looking at those two boys in the garden, she felt a shiver run down her spine, an inexplicable certainty that she was witnessing something important, something that would change not only that family, but perhaps many other lives in ways none of them could yet foresee. That night, during dinner, Roger announced that he had enrolled Kyle in a nearby private school, the same one where Peter studied through adapted online classes. The boy would start next Monday and would need uniforms, school supplies, everything a normal child needed. Valerie almost choked on her wine. "Are you serious? You're going to invest in formal education for him now?" "Why not? Every child deserves an education, and Kyle is intelligent. He'll do well." "You're getting too attached, Roger. This isn't healthy. For either of you." "Perhaps I am," he admitted calmly. "Or perhaps I'm finally doing the right things for the right reasons. Have you ever considered that possibility?" Valerie threw her napkin onto the table and left without finishing her meal. Roger sighed, but had no regrets. He knew the path he had chosen would not be easy, that he would face resistance from all sides. But for the first time in years he felt he was living, with purpose, that his actions had meaning beyond numbers in financial reports and approval in shareholder meetings. Peter and Kyle exchanged knowing glances from across the table. There was a silent understanding between them, a connection that didn't need words to be real. They knew, even if not yet completely, that something extraordinary was happening in that house, something that would test the limits of belief, science, and reality itself. The next morning, Valerie met Stephen for coffee at a discreet hotel in central London. They needed to talk unheard, needed to plan how to deal with what both considered Roger's growing instability. What began as a concerned conversation quickly turned into something more calculated, more dangerous. Stephen saw an opportunity to finally take control of the company, and Valerie, even without fully realizing it, was being manipulated into helping him achieve that goal. Meanwhile, at the mansion, Kyle was in the garden again, this time alone. He knelt on the grass, closed his eyes, and began to pray silently, as his grandmother had taught him years ago. He asked for nothing for himself, never did. He merely gave thanks for the opportunity given to him, for the chance to be there, and asked for guidance on how to use the gift he carried without pride, without seeking recognition, only with love and humility. The wind blew gently through the trees, carrying the scent of garden flowers, and also, perhaps, an answer that only Kyle could hear. He smiled, that serene smile that had become his trademark, and opened his eyes to the blue sky above. He knew difficult times would come, that he would be tested in ways he couldn't yet imagine. But he also knew he was not alone, that a greater force guided him, and that in the end, love would always prevail over fear, light would always dispel darkness. The weeks that followed brought changes no one in the Alastair family could have predicted. Kyle began attending school, and although initially there was awkwardness from other students and some teachers, his gentle nature and surprising intelligence soon earned respect. He absorbed knowledge with a thirst that impressed educators, as if he were making up for years of lost learning in just a few months. Peter continued his online classes, but now with renewed enthusiasm. He spent afternoons helping Kyle with homework, and in the process rediscovered his own love for learning. More importantly, the movements in his legs continued to progress. He could now move not only his toes but feel slight muscle contractions in his calf. It was a slow, gradual miracle that defied all medical logic but was undeniably real. Roger took Peter for a consultation with the neurologist who had been treating him for years. The doctor, Dr. Owen, a 60-year-old man with decades of experience, was visibly perplexed upon examining the results of the new tests. "This is absolutely extraordinary," he murmured, studying the images from the neurological exam. The spinal cord. Injury that caused the paralysis remains there, unaltered, but somehow we are seeing neural activity in areas that should be completely inactive. It's as if the brain is finding alternative pathways, creating new connections to bypass the damage. "How is this possible?" Roger asked, holding Peter's hand. Dr. Owen took off his glasses and cleaned them slowly, buying time to formulate a response. "Frankly, I don't know. Neuroplasticity exists, yes, the brain's ability to reorganize itself and form new neural connections. But I've never seen it happen in such an old and severe injury. There would have to be some kind of very powerful stimulus, something that activated healing processes that are not normally possible in cases like Peter's." "What kind of stimulus?" Roger pressed, thinking immediately of Kyle. The doctor shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with his inability to provide a scientific explanation. "Intensive therapies, hormonal changes, significant psychological alterations that impact brain biochemistry, or frankly, something that current science doesn't yet fully comprehend. Whatever the cause, we will continue to monitor closely. If this improvement continues, we may eventually consider procedures that were once useless but may now have some chance of success." Peter left the office radiant, and Roger knew exactly what his son was thinking. Kyle. It had all started after Kyle's arrival. But how was that possible? Roger was a rational man. He had built his life on logic and numbers, but he was being forced to consider possibilities that his mind instinctively rejected. Meanwhile, Valerie and Stephen intensified their efforts to discredit Roger. Stephen spread subtle rumors in business circles about his brother's emotional instability, his obsession with a street boy, his increasingly erratic decisions. He managed to get some board members to start questioning Roger's leadership, planting seeds of doubt that would grow slowly but surely. The situation exploded when a video began circulating on social media. Someone had filmed Kyle in the park near the school, helping an elderly gentleman who had fallen to the ground. The boy not only helped the man up, but stayed there talking to him for several minutes, apparently offering comfort. The video itself would be nothing extraordinary, except for one detail that was widely discussed. At the end of the recording, the elderly man, who appeared to be in pain, stood up with surprising ease, as if the simple contact with Kyle had invigorated him. The video quickly went viral, with millions of views in a few days. Comments were divided between those who believed Kyle had some special gift and those who saw only a coincidence being exploited by credulous people. Traditional media picked up the story, and soon reports began to appear about the mysterious boy living with the Alistair family, one of the most prominent names in London's business world. Roger arrived home one night and found 3 TV station vans parked in front of the gate. Reporters shouted questions through the intercom. Cameras pointed at any movement within the property. He entered through the garage, irritated and worried about the impact this would have not only on Kyle but on the entire family, especially Peter. Inside the house, he found Valerie in a state of controlled fury. "Do you see what you've caused? Now we're national news. My mother called horrified, my friends are avoiding me, and there are journalists camped at our door." "I didn't cause anything," Roger replied, trying to remain calm. "Kyle just helped someone, as he always does. He didn't film it, he didn't post it online. But you brought him into our lives, you exposed this family to this circus." The discussion was interrupted by Stephen's arrival, who didn't wait to be announced before entering the room. "Roger, we need to talk urgently. The board has scheduled an extraordinary meeting for tomorrow. They want to discuss your ability to continue leading the company under the current circumstances." "What circumstances?" Roger asked, though he already knew the answer. "The negative media exposure, the questions about your judgment, the concern that your personal decisions are affecting the corporate reputation." Stephen seemed almost satisfied as he delivered the bad news. "They're going to request a formal psychological evaluation and possibly a temporary leave of absence." It was at that moment that Roger clearly understood the game being played. He looked at his brother, then at Valerie, and saw there not just concern, but something more calculated, colder. "You're behind this, aren't you, Stephen?" he accused, his voice dangerously low. "You use this whole situation as an excuse to finally try to take my place." "It's not about taking your place," Stephen defended himself, but there was guilt in his eyes. "It's about protecting the company our father built. You're not well, Roger. Anyone from the outside can see that." Roger felt anger rising, but before he could respond, a soft voice cut through the tension. "Perhaps I should leave." Everyone turned to find Kyle standing at the entrance to the living room, Peter beside him in his wheelchair. None of them had noticed the boy's arrival, so absorbed were they in the discussion. "No," Peter said immediately, his voice firm despite the fear in his eyes. "You're not going anywhere." "Peter, this is none of your business," Valerie began, but her son interrupted her. "Yes, it is my business. It's my business because for the first time in my life I have a real friend. Because since Kyle arrived here I felt hope again. Because for the first time in 10 years I can move my legs." The silence that followed was absolute. Everyone stared at Peter as if he had just announced he could fly. It was Valerie who finally found words. "What did you say?" "I said I can move my legs." Peter looked at Kyle, who gave a small nod of encouragement. "It started a few weeks ago. First it was just my toes, but now it's more. I can feel things I haven't felt in years, and it all started after Kyle arrived." Roger approached his son, kneeling beside the chair. "Is it true? Why didn't you tell us before?" "Because I was afraid it wasn't real," Peter admitted, tears beginning to stream down his face. "I was afraid it was just my imagination, that if I spoke it aloud everything would disappear. But Dr. Owen confirmed it. It's really happening, Dad. My body is healing." Valerie put her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. She looked at Kyle, truly looked at him for the first time since the boy had entered her home. She saw there not the intruder she had tried so hard to reject, but a child who, in some inexplicable way, was giving her back the possibility of having her son back. "How?" she whispered. "How is this possible?" Kyle shrugged, uncomfortable with all the attention on him. "I didn't do anything, I just befriended him, I just was present." But Roger remembered that feeling of warmth when Kyle touched his chest on the night of the heart attack, the inexplicable peace that emanated from the boy. The small things he had witnessed in recent weeks, subtle signs he had ignored, because his rational mind refused to accept what they implied. Stephen watched the scene with a mixture of skepticism and unease. "This is ridiculous," he said, but his voice lacked the conviction he tried to convey. "Are you suggesting this boy has some kind of healing power? This is superstition, magical thinking." "Call it what you want," Roger replied, standing up to face his brother. "But something is happening here that none of us can explain. And if you're so worried about the company, you should consider what would happen if the story of a possible miraculous healing of my son became public. The Alistair Company associated with a true miracle. Imagine the positive impact of that." Stephen opened his mouth to reply, but realized he had no arguments. The truth, which he was reluctant to admit even to himself, was that his ambition had blinded him to what truly mattered. He looked at his nephew, saw the tears of hope on his face, and for the first time in weeks felt something beyond strategic calculation. He felt shame. "I need to go," he murmured, quickly leaving the room and the house, leaving behind a family that was slowly beginning to mend. Valerie approached Kyle with hesitant steps. The boy looked at her with those dark, deep eyes, without judgment, without resentment, just with a serene understanding that seemed far beyond his years. She knelt before him, putting herself at his level, and for the first time since he arrived, truly saw him for what he was. A child who had suffered more than any child should, but who nevertheless kept an essential goodness intact. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Sorry for being so hard on you, for trying to push you away, for not seeing the gift that you are." Kyle lightly touched her hand. "You were afraid. I understand. Sometimes, when good things appear, we can't believe they're real because we've been hurt too much before." Those simple words broke something inside Valerie, a dam she had kept closed for years. She began to cry for real, not the restrained, elegant tears she allowed in social situations, but deep sobs that came from a place of ancient, unprocessed pain. Roger approached and hugged her, and for the first time in a decade, husband and wife allowed themselves to be vulnerable with each other. Peter and Kyle watched, hands intertwined, two boys who in different ways had been saved by that improbable encounter. Mrs. Clara appeared at the entrance of the living room. She had been a silent witness to everything, and she too had tears streaming down her face. There was something sacred in that moment, something that transcended words and rational explanations. The board meeting the next day was different from what Stephen had planned. He arrived early, prepared to present his case against Roger, but found a very different version of his brother waiting for him. This Roger was calm, centered, with a clarity in his eyes that hadn't been seen in years. He was not the work-obsessed man Stephen knew, nor the cold, calculating businessman who had built an empire. He was something more complete, more human. Before the meeting began, Roger asked for a few minutes to speak. He addressed the board not with defensive arguments, but with brutal honesty about his journey in recent months. He spoke about the heart attack, about the existential crisis that followed, about the decision to help Kyle and how it had transformed not only his family but himself. "I failed," he admitted before the board members. "I failed as a husband, as a father, and in many respects as a leader. I hid behind work because it was easier than facing the difficult parts of life. But in recent months, I've learned something fundamental. A company, no matter how successful, is worth nothing if you lose your humanity in the process. If you think this makes me unfit to lead, then perhaps you are right. But I prefer to be an imperfect leader who is growing than a perfect executive who is empty inside." The silence in the room was dense. Stephen, sitting beside his brother, felt the weight of his own choices. He had spent years envying Roger's position, planning how to take control, but had never stopped to consider the personal cost that came with that power. Looking at his brother now, he saw not weakness, but strength, the courage to admit flaws and seek change. When the vote happened, the board decided to keep Roger in his position, but on the condition that he delegate more, that he create a better balance between personal and professional life. Stephen, to everyone's surprise, including his own, voted in favor of his brother. After the meeting, the two talked in the parking lot, a difficult but necessary conversation about ambition, family, and what truly mattered at the end of the day. In the weeks that followed, The Alistair family's story continued to capture public attention. Some saw Kyle as a divine messenger, others an intelligent charlatan, and many simply didn't know what to think. But inside that mansion in London, away from the spotlight and speculation, something genuinely miraculous continued to happen. Peter progressed to the point of being able to stand with help, then take a few shaky steps, supported by parallel bars. The doctors had no explanations, only meticulously documenting each advance, aware that they were witnessing something that defied everything they knew about neurology. Some professionals attributed the improvement to deep psychological factors. Others humbly acknowledged that there were mysteries in medicine that still could not be explained. Kyle continued to be simply Kyle. He studied diligently, played with Peter, helped Mrs. Clara when he could, and never sought credit or recognition for what was happening around him. When people asked him about his supposed powers, he just smiled and said he did what his heart told him, that he prayed for, those he loved, and that the rest was in the hands of something greater than all of them. Valerie went through her own transformation. She started therapy, finally confronting the guilt she had carried since Peter's accident. Little by little, she opened up not only to the therapist but to her own family. Conversations with Roger, once superficial and full of unsaid resentment, became deeper, more honest. They didn't fix everything overnight, but for the first time in years, they were genuinely trying to reconnect. Mrs. Clara, whose back pain that had tormented her for decades had mysteriously disappeared after a few weeks of living with Kyle, became his fiercest defender. When neighbors or acquaintances made negative comments, she confronted them with a passion that surprised everyone who knew her generally docile nature. One evening, 6 months after Kyle's arrival, the family gathered in the garden for a simple celebration. Peter had managed for the first time in 10 years to take 7 consecutive steps without help. They weren't firm steps. His gait was unsteady, and he had to sit down immediately afterwards, exhausted. But they were real steps, movements that doctors had said were impossible. Roger raised a glass. "Self juice," because Kyle didn't drink alcohol and they wanted everyone to be able to toast together. To Peter, he said, his voice choked with emotion, for his courage, his perseverance, and for never giving up even when all reasons said he should. To Peter, everyone repeated, raising their glasses. And to Kyle, Peter added, looking at the friend who had become a brother, for appearing when we needed it most, even without knowing it, and for showing us that miracles are not sudden events, but slow processes of love, faith, and persistence. To Kyle, the voices echoed. The boy blushed, uncomfortable with the attention, but accepted the toast with the grace that had become his trademark. He looked around at those people who had welcomed him, who had become his family when he thought he would always be alone, and felt a gratitude so profound that no words could adequately express it. Later, when everyone had retired, Kyle remained in the garden under the stars. He knelt on the grass as he did every night, closed his eyes, and prayed. He thanked for the journey, for the challenges that strengthened him, for the people who crossed his path. And he asked, as he always asked, for wisdom to use his gift with humility, never to be proud of it, never to forget that it was not he who healed, but something that worked through him. A gentle breeze blew through the garden, carrying the scent of jasmine and something more, something intangible but comforting. Kyle smiled, feeling that familiar presence that had accompanied him since his grandmother passed away, the certainty that he was never truly alone, that he was guided by something greater, wiser, infinitely loving. Inside the house, Roger watched from his study window. He still didn't completely understand what was happening. His rational mind still struggled with the implications of what he witnessed. But he had learned something fundamental, that not everything needs to be understood to be accepted, that there are mysteries in the universe that science may never fully explain, and that sometimes the wisest thing we can do is simply surrender to the miracle and be grateful to be alive to witness it. Valerie entered the study, silently approaching Roger. Together they watched Kyle in the garden, that small figure who had brought so much transformation into their lives. She intertwined her fingers with Roger's, a simple gesture that meant more than 1,000 words. They had lost so much time, wasted so many years in estrangement and resentment. But perhaps it wasn't too late. Perhaps, just as Peter was relearning to walk, they could relearn to be a family. Peter, in his room, wrote in his diary about the day, about the steps he had taken, about the incredible feeling of feeling the ground under his feet again. But more than that, he wrote about friendship, about hope, about how a single person can completely change the course of several lives, simply by being authentically and lovingly themselves. The clock in the living room struck midnight, ending another day in the Alistair mansion. But unlike so many days that came before, this one ended not with heavy silences and shared loneliness, but with lighter hearts, more connected souls, and a family that was slowly, miraculously, learning to be a family again. Kyle finally came in, went up to his room, and before sleeping, looked out the window at the city lights spreading to the horizon. Somewhere out there, he knew, there were other people suffering, other broken families, other lonely children. He couldn't help everyone, but he had helped this family, and that was enough for now. Because real, true changes don't happen on a large scale first. They happen one heart at a time, one family at a time, one silent miracle at a time. And as he slept, the city continued its nocturnal dance outside, indifferent and immense. But inside that mansion, something precious had been rescued from oblivion, the ability to believe, to love, to transform. And that, more than any scientific or religious explanation, was the true miracle that Kyle had brought with him on that stormy night that now seemed to have happened in another life. 3 months had passed since that memorable night in the garden when Peter had taken his first steps. Spring had arrived in London, bringing longer days and a pleasant warmth that seemed to reflect the new spirit inhabiting the Alistair mansion. But not everything was smooth sailing on that journey of family reconstruction. Transformation, as Kyle often said with his peculiar wisdom, was not a straight line, but a spiral that sometimes needed to revisit old places before moving forward. Peter could now walk increasing distances with the aid of special crutches. His physiotherapist, Dr. Marianne, an experienced professional who had been with him since the accident, openly admitted that she was witnessing something that defied her medical understanding. She meticulously documented each advance, sharing the results with colleagues who responded with a mixture of fascination and educated skepticism. Some suggested that perhaps the initial diagnosis had been wrong, that the injury had never been as severe as thought. But the old exams did not lie, and the truth was that something extraordinary continued to happen. Monday morning began like all others, since Kyle had officially become part of the family. The guardianship documents had been finalized 2 weeks prior, with Roger and Valerie formally assuming custody of the boy. Kyle woke early, as was his custom, and went down to the kitchen where he found Mrs. Clara already preparing breakfast. The housekeeper hummed an old tune softly as she arranged fresh fruit, and her face radiated a peace that hadn't existed before. "Good morning, Mrs. Clara," Kyle greeted, automatically grabbing plates to start setting the table. "Good morning, my dear. Did you sleep well?" She turned to look at him with the affection of someone who had finally found the grandson she never had. "You have a math test today, don't you?" "Yes, I do, but I studied a lot with Peter yesterday. I think I'll do well." "Of course you will. You're a brilliant boy." She approached and tidied his hair with a maternal gesture. "Your grandmother must be very proud up there seeing the man you're becoming." Kyle smiled, that serene smile that had become his trademark, but there was a shadow of sadness in his eyes. He still missed his grandmother, especially at times like this when life offered him good things and he wanted to share them with her. But he had learned to live with that absence, transforming the pain into motivation to honor the teachings she had left him. Roger came down for breakfast still in his bathrobe, something unthinkable a few months ago, when he would already be leaving the house at 6 in the morning in a pristine suit. The change in routine had been one of the conditions he had imposed on himself after the board meeting. Now, he dedicated his mornings to his family, arriving at the office only after 10 o'clock, and delegating much more responsibility to his trusted team. "Dad, can I ask for something?" Kyle asked as everyone sat down to eat. "Of course, what do you need?" "I was thinking about the boys who still live on the streets, near where I used to stay. With your permission, I'd like to start a project to help them. Nothing too big, just bringing food, blankets, maybe helping some find shelters or get documents. Roger exchanged a look with Valerie, who nodded slightly. They had talked about something like this, knowing it was only a matter of time until Kyle expressed the desire to help others who were in the situation he had been in. "I think that's an excellent idea," Roger replied. "We can organize it through the company's foundation. I'll assign a team to work with you, structure everything properly." "But I want to be truly involved," Kyle insisted. "I don't just want to put my name on a project that other people do. I want to go there, talk to them, understand what they need." Valerie, who in recent months had learned to see Kyle not as a threat, but as a blessing, intervened with genuine concern. "We understand that, Kyle. But you also need to understand that now you have responsibilities here. You have school. You have your safety to think about. We can find a balance between helping others and taking care of yourself." The conversation continued during breakfast, with the family discussing possibilities and setting healthy boundaries. It was a scene that would have been impossible months ago, when each person at that table lived isolated in their own world of silences and resentments. Now they talked, debated, truly listened to each other. Peter arrived in the kitchen, supported by his crutches, but with a smile that lit up his still, thin face, which was much healthier than before. "I heard you talking about the project. I want to help too. I can take care of the organization part, make spreadsheets, coordinate online donations." Roger felt his heart swell with pride, seeing the two boys, each with their own limitations and challenges, wanting to use their experiences to help others. This was what Kyle had brought to that house, he thought. Not just the possibility of physical healing, but something much deeper. A transformation of values, a redefinition of what truly mattered in life. At school, Kyle continued to be a mystery to many, but was widely respected. Some classmates avoided him, uncomfortable with the stories circulating about him, with the weight of their own beliefs or disbeliefs about the supernatural. Others sought him out constantly, wanting to be near him as if his presence could bring some luck or blessing. Kyle treated both groups with the same quiet kindness, never taking offense at rejection nor allowing himself to be inflated by excessive interest. It was during lunch break that something happened that would test his serenity again. A group of older boys, led by Ben, a 15-year-old known as a bully, surrounded Kyle in the courtyard. "Hey, miracle boy," Ben mocked, lightly pushing Kyle's shoulder. "Why don't you use your magic powers to make money appear? Or does that only work when there's a camera filming?" The other boys laughed, but it was a nervous, uncomfortable laugh. Most of them didn't really want to cause trouble, but they followed Ben out of fear of becoming the next targets. Kyle remained calm, his eyes meeting Ben's without challenge, but also without fear. "I don't have magic powers, Ben. I never said I did. I just do what I can to help people when they need it." "Oh yeah? And who asked for your help? Who made you the savior of the world?" Ben took a step closer, using his superior height to intimidate. "You're just a street kid who got lucky enough to find a rich family stupid enough to believe your lies." It was then that Mrs. Carmen, the pedagogical coordinator who had been observing the scene from a distance, intervened in a firm voice. "Ben, my office now, and the rest of you, go back to your classes. Break is over." The group dispersed quickly, but Ben shot a final defiant look at Kyle before following the teacher. Kyle remained standing for a moment, taking a deep breath, letting the tension leave his shoulders. It wasn't the first time he had faced hostility, nor would it be the last. People were afraid of what they didn't understand, and instead of seeking understanding, they often attacked. That afternoon, when he returned home, Kyle found a surprise waiting for him. Stephen was in the living room talking with Roger. In recent months, the relationship between the brothers had improved considerably. Stephen, confronted with his own ambitions and almost losing his brother, in the process, had done painful but necessary internal work. He was still vice president of the company, but now he genuinely worked alongside Roger instead of against him. "Kyle, good that you're here," Stephen said, standing up with a smile that was very different from the calculated expressions he used to wear. "I wanted to thank you personally." "Thank me? For what?" Kyle asked, confused. "For saving my family and for saving me from myself." Stephen seemed genuinely moved. I was so focused on gaining power that I forgot what truly matters. Seeing the transformation that happened here, seeing my brother becoming human again, my nephew walking again, made me realize how lost I was. Kyle approached and, in a simple but powerful gesture, extended his hand to Stephen. The man shook it, and in that handshake there was more than formal greeting. There was reconciliation, forgiveness, and the possibility of new beginnings. "You weren't lost," Kyle said with his serene wisdom. "You were just walking in a direction that wasn't taking you where your heart truly wanted to go. But you realized that and changed direction. That takes a lot of courage." That night during dinner, Valerie made an announcement that surprised everyone. "I've decided to go back to work," she said, looking around the table. "Not in the company's business, but in something of my own. I want to open a support center for families of children with disabilities, a place where they can find not only practical resources but also emotional support." Roger took her hand across the table, his eyes shining with pride. "I think that's wonderful, Val. You have so much to offer, so much valuable experience that can help other families." "It was Kyle who inspired me," Valerie admitted, looking at the boy with an affection she would never have imagined feeling months ago. "Seeing how you want to help others even after everything you've been through made me realize that I was wasting my life on trivialities. I have resources, I have time, I have a story that can make a difference. Why not use all of that for good?" Peter was radiant. "We can partner, Mum. Your center can work with Kyle's project for street children. Many of them have untreated disabilities." The conversation flowed naturally into plans and possibilities, each person contributing ideas, the energy at the table palpable and positive. Mrs. Clara served dinner with discreet tears in her eyes, a privileged witness to a transformation she knew was rare and precious. Later, when everyone had retired, Valerie knocked softly on Kyle's bedroom door. The boy was finishing his homework, concentrated on a geometry problem. "Come in," he said, recognizing the knock. Valerie sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped in her lap. There was something she needed to say, something that had been growing in her heart for weeks, but only now found the courage to express. "Kyle, I need to tell you something." He closed his notebook and gave her his full attention, those dark eyes that seemed to see through all defenses and pretenses. "You can speak. When you arrived here, I saw you as a threat. I was so afraid you would destroy the perfect image I fought to maintain, the facade I had built to hide my own pain and guilt." Valerie paused, the words difficult but necessary. "But you didn't destroy anything. You just showed that that image was empty, that beneath all that superficial perfection, there was a broken family desperately in need of healing." "I know," Kyle said softly. "And now you are healing. Not because of me, but because you chose to face the truth and do the hard work of change. But it was you who gave us that chance. It was your presence, your persistent kindness even when I rejected you, that created the space for this transformation to happen." Valerie reached out and lightly touched the boy's face. "You gave me back my son, Kyle. Not just physically, but emotionally. You gave me back my husband, my marriage, my own humanity. How can I thank you for that?" "You're already thanking me," he replied with a smile. "By choosing to live differently, by opening your heart, by deciding to use your pain to help others. That is the best gratitude there is." Valerie then hugged him, a long, tight embrace that carried years of repressed emotions finally finding healthy release. When they separated, both had tears in their eyes, but they were tears of liberation, not sadness. "Can I call you Mum?" Kyle asked suddenly, his voice small and vulnerable in a way he rarely showed. "I know. I'll never forget my grandmother, and you'll never replace her. But you've become a mother to me, and I'd like to be able to call you that," Valerie sobbed, bringing her hands to her face to contain the overwhelming emotion. "I would love that, Kyle. I would love to be your mother. And I promise I will try to be the mother you deserve, that I will learn every day how to love you better." That night, when he was finally alone, Kyle knelt beside his bed as he did every night. His prayers were simple, direct, full of gratitude. He thanked for that family that had welcomed him, for Peter, who had become his brother in every sense that mattered, for Roger and Valerie, who gave him not just a roof but a true home. And he asked, as he always asked, for strength to continue being an instrument of love and healing in a world that so desperately needed it. Outside, the city of London continued its frantic dance, millions of lives intertwined in dramas big and small. But inside that mansion that was no longer a symbol of empty success, but of genuine transformation, a family slept in peace. A family that had learned, through the improbable presence of a street boy with an inexplicable gift, that true miracles do not happen in an instant, but unfold day after day, choice after choice, through the courage to look within, to change, to love despite fear. And as the city slept under the starry sky, something subtle but powerful continued in motion, proving that no night is so dark that it cannot be illuminated, no heart so hardened that it cannot be softened, and no family so broken that it cannot be mended when love, faith, and the will to change meet in the right place and time.